Okay, before we turn to read the book or the video, I want to return to Byrne et al. For a little bit. And that's the chapter from their textbook of International Health, Global Health in a Dynamic World. And we were looking at their chapter 12, Understanding and Organizing Healthcare Systems Around the World. We were looking at this approach as a contrast to the one that Reed takes in his book. The approach of Byrne and her collaborators is one based on a very broad view of political economy. It's one based on a very macro view of the way societies are organized, in fact parts of the world are organized, and it relies heavily on a notion of social stratification, based on the principle that all societies that we know of really depart very substantially from an egalitarian ideal and have very different divisions of status and income and privilege, and that's what social stratification means. There are people on top who have resources, who have status, who have means, who have power, and lots and lots and lots of other people, majority of the population in most places, who are below them, in many cases, far below them in much lower strata. That's what a political, economic, stratification-based approach. The result of social stratification for healthcare is that just as societies in general are by and large not egalitarian, but are divided in these different ways, different degrees of privilege and access and so on, so is healthcare and health, which is reflected in the inverse care law that I quoted last time and that I'll recall your attention to today. It's derived from a kind of sardonic summary of realities that an Englishman, Julian Tudor Hart, was able to synthesize in the following statement. That's on the bottom of page 589. The availability of good medical care tends to vary inversely with the need for it in the population served. And one way of stating that is that the inverse care law says, and it's like one of those sardonic laws like Parkinson's law or Murphy's law that sort of sums up good pieces of human behavior in a kind of witty and detached way. It says that those who need care most, in the bottom strata, are those who tend to get it least. And those who need care least because they're already robust, healthy, have all sorts of other privileges that support their status and their physical well-being, get it most. That's just the way it is. It's not desired, it's not the ideal, it's not an aspiration, it's the way it is. The world isn't fair, is one way of summing it up. It's a grim reality. And it's not fair globally if you look at the broad distributions of population and wealth between what's often called the global north, where most of the wealth and advanced industry and science and technology reside, as contrasted to the global south, where a great deal of the human population lives often in great suffering and misery. And so, as they point out on page 590, there is an application of the inverse care law in a very direct way in the global north and the global south. So on top of page 590, they point out that the OECD member countries, those are wealthy countries by and large in the global north, on average spend an average of 8.9% of their GDP on healthcare, which is quite in contrast to countries in the global south. By contrast, per capita spending in lower income countries range from $2 to $550 a year per person, accounting for 1 to 7% of GDPs, which are smaller than the GDPs of those countries in the north. For example, continuing this paragraph, top of page 590, Madagascar spends 2.7% of its GDP on health, which is equal to $24 US per capita per year per person. That's $24 contrasted to, well, when those numbers were put together, it wouldn't have been the U.S. 8,400 per capita per year in contrast to 27. It may have been a mere 6,500 per year, because those numbers are always updated. But you can understand that huge discrepancy. So the world isn't fair, and the inverse care law tells us how unfair it is in the distribution and access to health care. It's also not fair within countries. And there are several different countries and kinds of societies that the authors run through. One area that they look at pretty hard is Latin America, which we can understand is a post-colonial society. It was originally colonized, if you think back, during the period of the conquistadors and so on by Spain and Portugal, and there were very important colonial legacies that remained, and it's only really in the 19th, in some cases the 20th century, that those countries have been able to go past their colonial domination and to begin to achieve greater independence. In those societies, perhaps because of colonial legacies, because in the colony we had a European elite that took or stole the resources and lived very well and protected themselves against the citizenry and against the diseases they carried, using whatever means they could, and the vast horde of people who toiled in the mines and the fields to produce the wealth that the Europeans then stole and shipped back to Europe. That's what a colony is about, wherever in the world it happens. And there are considerable legacies of that, because over a period as a country is gradually decolonizing, and there's a lot of literature about this, it recruits an elite from the indigenous population who are most like the Europeans, who are most willing to adopt European values and styles and languages and go to their schools. And that becomes the sort of designated puppet elite run by the colonial elite. And that puppet elite remains in control of the country, even if the colonial elite picks up stakes and goes back to its European home altogether. But that leaves, obviously, the basis for substantial stratification. And so we see a lot of stratification in Latin America, in the healthcare system, which shouldn't surprise us when you put things in that broad historical perspective. So they talk about Latin America, pages 609, bottom, and then the following page, 610, 611. And here are some of the things that they say. This is a stratified system. In many Latin American countries, the health sector is characterized by stratified healthcare arrangements. No surprise, shouldn't be if you just think about the context in which those systems develop. And then they continue on page 610 in this language. The region has developed a multi-tiered, fragmented health system, or health systems, with the employment sector and the level of wealth determining medical coverage. Elites obtain services in the private sector. Formal workers are covered under separate social insurance schemes, but the large informal workforce and indigent populations receive services in underfunded public facilities or pay out of pocket. In 2000, over 50% of the population in Mexico had no health insurance coverage whatsoever and relied on public clinics of uneven quality, supplies, and staffing. Poor, indigenous, and rural populations were overrepresented, obviously, in this group. Meanwhile, over half of the healthcare expenditures occurred in the private sector, mostly covering a small elite. So there's stratification, the application of the inverse care law, the application of inequity globally, north-south, and within countries, especially those with colonial residues and colonial pasts. They say also on page 611, to really drive in the point, this is referring to Guatemala and Argentina, service to poor, top of 611, and marginalized populations are mostly provided by the under-resourced public sector, with the private sector covering the rich.
The continuation of multiple and exclusive systems reinforces inequities, particularly in access to quality care. Two other formerly colonial countries with important colonial legacies and with important stratification of elites and the vast mass of population that we should look at, that they look at briefly, are South Africa and India. We know that South Africa was colonized by the English and the Dutch and Dutch fought wars and so on, but the vast mass of the population is the native population. The native population was actually grouped together on native reserves, much like American Indian populations were removed from their lands and put on reservations where they were contained and controlled by the white elite. This happened in South Africa. And South Africa added to that, beginning really in the 40s and 50s, the vicious policies of apartheid and all those laws and rules which were only, at least officially, outlawed or repealed in the 1990s. And the great leader, Mandela, who had been in prison for his struggle against the apartheid regime, was finally released from prison and was remarkably elected president of South Africa by a popular majority, a huge popular majority, including many of the whites, and he tried to forge a government. But there were so many colonial legacies and such inequities in distribution of resources that even if there was on paper some version of democracy in the electoral process, there was really a vast continuation of inequities and elitism and favoritism. And that, of course, will show up in healthcare. Things in a society show up in healthcare. Here's a little bit of what the authors say on the bottom of page 612, top of page 613. South Africa has undergone faster implementation of universal health care because of this transformation from its apartheid regime to its more democratic regime with Mandela's election, but through a mixed public-private financing system. The post-apartheid government, elected in 1995, made health care a universal right for the first time. But they could not bring the resources to bear to make that right a reality in many people's lives. So currently, the public sector is responsible for about 85% of the population, accounting for 44% of total healthcare expenditures. The private sector accounts for 56% of healthcare expenditures, but serves just 15% of the population. Which 15%? Obviously, the elites, which remain in considerable power and authority. And they comment on page 613, there remain considerable inequities by region and social groups. South Africa's health system continues to face great challenges and great social inequities, people living in marginal circumstances and so on, despite the apparent attainment of democracy as a political, if not reality, as a political system. But that system cannot rearrange the resources because elites will continue to hold on to them very, very strongly. India is another post-colonial society. India only achieved its independence from British rule in the 1940s, in the role of Mahatma Gandhi as the great leader of that, beginning really in the 1920s and continuing through the decades. But is a story that many of you know. It's a story that we should learn things from, and there's much to admire about Gandhi and his leadership and his strategies. But even with Gandhi as an inspiration and the people following in his leadership, we're not able to achieve in post-colonial India, that is India from the late 40s to the present, egalitarianism, equality. There's still a very highly stratified society with the realities that people face every day. Here's how the authors sum up the realities of India on the bottom of page 613. Currently, there are 2 publicly financed insurance schemes which offer mixed public-private delivery to India's nearly now more than 1 billion citizens. Approximately 135 million people in the middle and upper economic strata, which is some 13% of the population, spend the vast majority of health rupees, although, etc. The remaining 800 million people, India's marginalized and working class, are forced to pay out of pocket for most of their health care needs, and they have, as you can imagine, precious little in those pockets to pay for what they get, so they don't get much, and what they get is of very dubious quality and efficacy. Health services are clearly the reflection of basic social, political, economic realities, and in most of the world that means a very dramatic stratification. The power and priorities of elites, their political and social values and desires is what prevails. So when you look at things from this very broad perspective, the kinds of things that we had focused on in the American context, such as interest group, political influence in representative bodies, legislatures and so on, political parties, professional organizations, the AMA and so on, and their politics and priorities, dim by comparison. They are of some interest, but not really front and center as the major explanatory foci that you need to concentrate on in order to understand what really is going on in these societies. Political economy and class structure remain the major influences. And so that creates the context for understanding some of the most dramatic events in the 20th century with regard to healthcare. More massive, more dramatic than decolonization in India, or even the end of apartheid in South Africa. And those events were, of course, political revolutions. I alluded to three last time. I'll remind you briefly in order of occurrence. The Russian, which is discussed briefly at least, by Byrne et al., pages 600 to 601. The Chinese, which is discussed by them, page 603. And the Cuban, which is discussed intermittently at several different points in the chapter. All three of the revolutions had important revolutionary leaders who were broadly committed to health equity and health redistribution, as well as to other revolutionary goals of taking down the elites and creating a more democratic society. They knew, they understood that part of the legacy of those pre-revolutionary situations was great inequity in health, and they wanted to change it. In Cuba, that was dramatically represented by Fidel's right-hand man, Che Guevara, who was very dedicated to health equity. He, in fact, had graduated from medical school and represented that view very, very powerfully within the Cuban Revolution, and then in his role essentially as foreign minister of Cuba, where it became, and still to this day is, one of the major exports of Cuba. That is the well-trained, scientifically based Western-style physicians who are trained in some very fine institutions. Cuba's public health system is a mix of very popular measures that are aimed at the peasant kind of level, the level of very poor people, and very simple basic things like nursing care and proper attendance of infants and all the rest of it. But there's also a high-tech element of Cuban medicine that is well represented there, and that is part of what Cuba exports to other parts of the developing world, especially to Latin America and to Africa, where they actually send Cuban physicians, and they also send Cuban-trained physicians, inviting in large numbers of folks from other Latin American countries or from Africa. They train them at one or another of the Cuban medical schools, and they send them back out as a contribution to uplift of society in a very idealistic way as they understand that. It happened even in the Bolshevik Revolution. and I waved this at you last time, the just out November 2017 issue of the American Journal of Public Health, which is devoted, as you can see from the iconography of Lenin on the cover, that's from a mural in the Moscow subway somewhere. This issue is dedicated to the memory and the evaluation of the positive dimensions of the Bolshevik Revolution for healthcare. So this is the centennial of it. It was in November 1917, and now we are in November 2017. Let's look back. And so there's a whole section of the journal which is devoted to, as it's called, Public Health Promises, Realities, and Legacies of the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917 to 2017, at the centenary. The scholar who helped put together this issue, I worked with him, as did the editor-in-chief, Alfredo Moravia, worked closely together. I have a couple of pieces in this issue. But the guy who really helped pull it together was the Russian history scholar Nikolai Krementsov, who was raised in and trained in Russia. He received his PhD in the history of science in Russia. He then made a lot of his career in North America, is currently a professor at Toronto, where he teaches history of medicine, international health. He is regarded as one of the 2 or 3 leading authorities on the development of medicine, healthcare, science in Russia and the Soviet Union. And his very highly regarded books are published by leading American publishers who publish in the history of science and medicine, University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins University, and other places. So Nikolai wrote the editorial for this issue that framed the papers. And I'd like to read from Nikolai's rather astute observations. This is someone who really is a very, very solid scholar, and this is what he says. Russia's 1917 revolution marked not only a political watershed, but also a public health watershed. Between the 2 world wars, Russia was transformed from a country with the highest mortality and morbidity rates in Europe, the lowest, that is relative to population, number of physicians and other health professionals, and an embryonic pharmaceutical industry, into one of the world's leading centers of medicine and public health, arousing admiration, envy, or censure throughout the world. This quantum leap was a direct result of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks were idealists and visionaries who dreamed of a new world, and their government was one of the first in the world to recognize the now common ideal of health as both an inalienable human right and a powerful instrument in national development, and to make public health one of its top priorities. Pragmatists and revolutionaries, they spared no effort, and their efforts were often brutal and barbarous, we've got to admit that, but they spared no effort to implement this ideal on the 1/6 of the world under their control. The Bolsheviks created a unique state system of health protection that integrated into a unified whole everything related to health. This was their system, that they integrate medical practices and institutions, health research and development, epidemiological surveillance, prophylactic measures, manufacturing and distribution of pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, specialized education and training, sanitary infrastructure and propaganda. This system was administered by something called the People's Commissariat of Health Protection, a top-level government agency established in July 1918, less than 1 year after the Bolsheviks seized power. And that entity's wide-ranging endeavors rested on 2 ideological pillars. The first was the acknowledgement of the primacy of social factors in defining the health status of individuals and groups, which today we call the social determinants of health. That was one of the foundations of this new approach in the revolutionary Russia. And the second pillar was the recognition of the primacy of prevention over-curative approaches to disease. So many Europeans, Americans and others, went to visit this brave new world in the Soviet Union to see a place in which prevention and public health was given first status, and biomedical sciences and so on, which were so dominant in the United States already, but no more so, took second place behind prevention. This was an absolutely amazing transformation. If we just take a glance at some of the things that a revolutionary regime can accomplish, let's just look at some numbers about Cuba that are contained on the table on page 591 in that same order. And then we will leave Byrne et al. And move on to Reed. But I think you should pay attention to this table. It's table 12.3 on the top of page 591. They run alongside data from Cuba, the United States in the middle, and Sweden. And they start, first line going across is the average income when these data were compiled in 2006. And so there's quite a contrast, of course, between Cuba's per capita income, which was down at $1,170, compared to the US at that time of $44,000 average income. But what really gets interesting is the health expenditure per capita. Cuba, given its relative poverty, no matter what its commitment, could at best spend $333 per capita on health, which is quite a bit more than some countries spending $24 a year without a revolutionary commitment. This was as a result of a revolutionary commitment. That contrasts to what was then $6,347 per year for the United States. Now we know it's a good deal more than that. But let's just take that ratio, which is roughly 20 to 1. The U.S., because of its substantial wealth, was able to invest 20 times as much in health care per capita than was Cuba. And yet, while Cuba was so much poorer and could have been afforded to invest only 1/20th of the U.S. Investment in health in its own investment, and yet, when you measure life expectancy, the United States life expectancy was 78, and Cuba's life expectancy was 78. How did they do that? Infant mortality rate was 7 in the United States then, and it was 5 in Cuba. Less, better, with 1/20th of the resources. And because of their commitment to health and training first-rate physicians, the U.S. produced at that time 26 physicians per 10,000 people, whereas in Cuba there were 59 physicians, more than twice as many, per 10,000 people, as a reflection of their priorities. What were they not building? Well, they were not building a nuclear arsenal and so on and so forth, and whatever else the United States thinks are its priorities. So you see, when certain clear-eyed people assess the world, note its inequity, and decide that the only way to try to change it is through dramatic revolutionary political means, it doesn't mean that they are aiming only at power and seizing totalitarian control, etc., though no one will condone Stalin and other atrocities that happened in the Soviet Union, for example. But there were, among the revolutionaries, great idealists who saw revolution as the only way forward to undo the results of inequity and stratification. Those are in revolutionary societies. But when we turn to Reed and the countries he looks at and the analysis he performs and what we see examples of vividly in the film, we are dealing with a very different set of international comparisons. He is focusing unabashedly, unashamedly, on capitalistic, democratic countries which are much, much more like the U.S. than any of the revolutionarily transformed societies that Byrne and her co-authors focus on in that chapter. They are much, much more like the United States. And the only country that is in the group that they look at in detail, Taiwan, is the only one that was in some sense touched by a 20th century revolution. You can say, well, there was the American Revolution in the 18th century. That's a different order of magnitude and different kind of reality altogether. We're talking about 20th century political revolutions. How was Taiwan connected? Well, Taiwan was the loser. There was a Chinese Revolution, and there were the people who resisted Mao, and the people who resisted Mao lost, and they were essentially pushed out of mainland China and created their own country on the island of Taiwan. They then developed to be as much like a capitalistic democratic society as they could, and did a very good job of that, but they were only created out of revolution as the losing side. It's not the same thing as revolutionary regimes in Russia, Soviet, Cuba, and China. So what we're dealing with, including Taiwan, are the political cultures of countries which are different from the United States, but not that different. Their social values are subtly different in important ways, but they're not revolutionarily different. And 5 of these countries will be the focus of the film that you'll see in class on Wednesday. The book by Reed has more detailed discussions of those 5 countries, Germany and England, etc., and Japan. You'll see them in film, you'll see them in the movie. And you'll read about them in the book. But in the book, there's more room, so we also include some additional discussions of importance. There's a discussion of France in some detail, which is not discussed in the movie. There's a discussion of Canada in the book, which is not covered in the movie. And there's even a little bit about India in the book, which is not covered in the movie. His basic message, which is captured in the title of his book, The Healing of America, A Global Quest for Better, Cheaper, and Fairer Health Care. And I don't remember what the exact title of the movie is, but it's similar in intent. The message is that we in the United States, who are concerned about health reform and the need to improve our system, can learn from these other countries. There are lessons that they have to teach us to heal the U.S.'s sick healthcare system. Now, when you start reading Reed's book, and I'm sure many of you have already, you'll notice that there is a lot of familiar material in the first few pages. And so it should be pretty easy reading. We've covered a lot of the same issues, maybe even some of the same numbers, as Reed presents in setting the context for why we need to look hard at the United States and why we need to turn our glance outward to learn from other countries. There are some subtle differences even there, though. So, for example, he points out on the bottom of page 36, top of page 37, that the monthly premium in the U.S. goes to paying for workers' medical bills. The insurance firms also soak up significant share of premium dollars to cover marketing, underwriting, and administration. Page 30 in the U.S., we talked about that, as well as profit. Economists agree that this is about the most expensive possible way to pay for a nation's health care bills. That's why we'll see throughout this book that in other developed countries that have also used insurance companies to provide much of the insurance in their systems. In other developed countries, the basic health insurance must be a non-profit operation. In those other countries, like France and Switzerland and so on, the insurance plans, sometimes run by the government, sometimes by private entities, exist only to pay people's medical bills, not to provide dividends for investors. So even when there are similarities that seem to connect very dramatically the way things happen in the United States and the way things happen in advanced European countries like Switzerland that are much like the United States in many ways, if you look closely, there are important differences. And that's repeated, again, page 40, bottom 41 top, where this emphasis on the country by its dictates, by its laws, not allowing private insurance companies to make a profit on basic health needs, rather only in supplemental policies after the basic health benefits are covered, can insurance companies, even if they are run for profit, seek profit by selling supplementary policies. That fundamental distinction is not a reality in the United States, and it's hard for me, given our political and lobbying situation, to imagine getting to such a reality. It's certainly not the reality in insurance companies that are part of the Affordable Care Act. Reed also makes a series of important points that he tells us he learned from Uwe Reinhardt. You remember that I cited Uwe Reinhardt before as one of those leading health policy analysts, health economists, who identified the charge master as early as 2005, 2006, before that blockbuster book that we've talked about by Stephen Brill. People, astute people like Uwe Reinhardt, one of the leading health policy analysts, health service researchers, was there early on. Well, we learn a little bit more about Uwe Reinhardt, who emerges as one of Reed's real heroes, someone he really respects a great deal. He tells us directly, at the end of his book, pages 269 to 270, that when he was writing this book, he was lucky to get, he was a working reporter, he worked for the Washington Post at that time, works for other newspapers now, he's a very, very popular and in demand reporter, analyst, but he needed kind of a sabbatical to sit down, think, learn more, read more, to write this book that he had in mind. He was offered a fellowship by Princeton University, the Woodrow Wilson School of International Relations, and while he was there, he decided in the 6 months or so of residence that he would take advantage of the vast resources of Princeton University, and he had vaguely heard of this guy called Uwe Reinhardt, who had been a fixture at Princeton since the late 1960s. So this is how he describes his contact with and impressions of Professor Reinhardt. Page 269. Shortly after I launched into this book, I taught a one-semester course at Princeton University. It was a quid pro quo. We'll give you residence, we'll support you, you can do whatever you want. You teach the course on journalism in global settings, that's what you do for our Woodrow Wilson students. Okay, quid pro quo. I was on campus, so I wandered over to the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, not Public Health, to sit on a graduate seminar which had the title WWS, Woodrow Wilson School 597, The Political Economy of Health Systems. The syllabus was formidable, and much of the subject matter looked to be as dry as dust. But 2 minutes into the professor's first lecture, I realized that WWS 597 was going to be a great educational experience. That's because the professor was Uwe Reinhardt, a global leader in the field of healthcare economics, and a superb teacher. Professor Reinhardt seemed to know all the strengths and all the weaknesses of every healthcare system in the world. He imparted this information with wit and intensity and a passion for the subject that my fellow students and I found irresistible. In just about every seminar, Reinhardt recited the central point of his course, which has now become a central message of this book. Quoting Professor Reinhardt, "Every nation's healthcare system reflects that nation's basic moral values." Every nation's healthcare system reflects that nation's basic moral values. Once a nation decides that it has a moral obligation to provide health care for everybody, then it can build a system to meet that obligation. And so, the clear take-home message is that the European and other countries that he examines had developed that sense of moral obligation, that everyone in their country was entitled to health care in as equitable way as possible. The United States, we know this by looking at our Constitution and failed judicial attempts to achieve it, the United States does not, as a nation, have that moral commitment. There are some of us who do, but as reflected in our political system, including even the political system that produced the Affordable Care Act, we have no such sense of moral obligation. The Affordable Care Act was a repair, a filling in of holes, a closing of gaps. It was not a transformation of America's health system according to a vision of moral commitment to health care, equity, and access. In those countries which do have it, especially the Europeans, because it's part of their vocabulary literally, they have a principle solidarity. It sounds and looks, from many Americans' perspectives, as too close to socialism. And Reed is well aware of the way, and talks about the way in which the invocation of socialism as a scare word has been used as part of our political process. If you label something socialism or socialized, in a process that I've described as sort of Pavlovian conditioning, knee-jerk reactions, Americans distance themselves from it and don't pursue that thing labeled that way with any seriousness. It's as if a bell goes off and the Pavlovian dog starts salivating without the presence of the even stimulus of the meat. It's a conditioned reaction. Socialism is bad, even though if we look closely and try to understand what socialism means, we have many parts of our society which are, in fact, socialized. National parks, public libraries, police systems, fire departments, and so on, in which there's a common public contribution for the delivery of service to people in need without a test first of privilege and resources. So we have to be careful to not let that bell ring and our Pavlovian automatic reflex reactions kick in, and that's a lesson that Reed wants us to understand clearly. European countries have different traditions, different ideas, different sense of what solidarity means, why they think it's a good thing, and so on. Another thing that Reed talks about that often confuses and distorts and complicates American political response is the deep, deep, deep belief, not necessarily founded empirically, on the notion of American exceptionalism. We are different, so there's nothing we can possibly learn from England or France, or even Canada, as much as Canada looks like us. They are different. America is exceptional, in which exceptional moves from being just different to being exceptionally good, better, as a value judgment. It's a notion of American exceptionalism that often gets in the way of intelligent progress. He dedicates the book, oddly, he points out, for a liberal journalist, generally thought of as sort of leaning slightly to the left, to Dwight D. Eisenhower, Republican, rather conservative president in the 50s, president who became a very popular figure as a result of his role in World War II as the head of the Supreme Allied Command, a great military leader and strategist and so on. Eisenhower learned something during his wartime experience that he applied during his presidency. And Reed says, we should pay attention to that. One of the things Eisenhower discovered militarily is that as he was slogging across Europe after the landings at Normandy and so on, and D-Day, and trying to move across and to create some pressure on the German troops by moving from west to east, at the same time, this is a crucial part of the victory in World War II, as the great Russian Red Army was moving from the east to the west, sweeping across Eastern Europe. And by the way, doing most of the liberation of the concentration camps, because most of the concentration camps were in places like Poland and Eastern Europe. And that's where the Red Army came and liberated them. As these two great military movements of the Allied forces coming from the west, the Allied forces had a great deal of trouble getting across France, these little rutted, stupid country roads, and the tanks and the trucks and the transport vehicles getting bogged down. And so it took them a very, very long time to get to the border of Germany. But when they finally got to the border of Germany, holy cow, they discovered this incredible highway system, the German Autobahn, built by the Nazis. And they say, well, we're not going to ride on this road because it's built by the Nazis. No, we're going to ride this road right to Berlin. And the progress transformed dramatically. And Eisenhower never forgot this lesson. So when he's president in the 50s, and he's presented with various options for creating an American highway system, do we keep the quaintness of our little two-lane highways? He remembers, that was like France. And I remember Germany. Of course we have to learn from Germany, even from Nazi Germany, if it's a technological advance we can use. And so Eisenhower, as a pragmatist, said, if we want to build that interstate system, that's when it was constructed, beginning under Eisenhower. We want to build this great interstate system of whatever, 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 and create a terrific network of superhighways. Our best model is Germany, even Nazi Germany, and we learned a very important practical lesson during World War II that saved lives and maybe helped win the war. Why would we not learn from other countries now? And so Reed, in that spirit, dedicates his book to Dwight D. Eisenhower in the spirit of open-minded willingness to learn from other countries and other systems, because the United States may be an exception, but not necessarily in a good way, and we have things to learn. Come right on time so we can see the maximum of the film on Wednesday morning.